I have lived in the same house for 11 years, and I know every sound it makes. That sounds like the kind of thing people say right before they admit they were wrong about something, and I guess it is, but I want you to understand what I mean by it before we get to the part where I was wrong. I mean, I knew this house the way a mechanic knows an engine he's worked on for a decade. Not just the big obvious things, the creak of the third stair from the bottom, the way the back door sticks in humidity and swings free in dry weather, the particular groan the water pipes make at 2 in the morning when the pressure in the system adjusts. I mean the small things. The way the living room radiator clicks 7 times before it gets to temperature on a cold morning. The way the wind hits the north side of the house and makes a sound like someone dragging furniture one room over. The way the attic insulation settles in the deep cold of January, a soft compression sound like something being slowly pressed down from above. I knew all of it, every tick, every moan, every sound this house made in every season and every weather condition. I'd cataloged them without meaning to, the way you catalog things you live with long enough. It was a habit from my work. I spent 11 years at that point as a residential property inspector, which is the job where you walk through houses before people buy them and find everything wrong so the buyer knows what they're getting into. You spend your days in other people's houses, in the crawl spaces and the attics and the basements, with a flashlight and a moisture meter and a trained eye for the things that hide in the places homeowners don't look. You develop a relationship with the sounds of structures. You learn to read what a sound means. A tick from this location in the afternoon means thermal expansion. A groan from that corner of the basement means the foundation has some flex in the middle section. A scrape from above the second floor ceiling means small animals have found a gap in the soffit. I was good at my job. I want to be clear about that, not because I'm bragging, but because it's relevant to everything that comes after. I was not someone who startled easily or imagined things or jumped to the strange explanation when the ordinary one was available. I had 15 years of professional skepticism about house sounds and structural noises, and the things people described to me at the start of an inspection with apologies and embarrassed qualifications. Things like, I know this probably has an explanation, but there's this sound we hear sometimes. And I would always find the explanation. Always. 15 years, hundreds of inspections, never a sound I couldn't source. Settlement, animals, pipes, thermal expansion. Wind pressure, HVAC irregularity. One memorable case that turned out to be a very large family of squirrels in the wall cavity between the first and second floors, which the homeowner had been hearing for 3 years and describing to their neighbors as something they couldn't explain. There's always an explanation. That was my professional belief. That was my operational assumption. That was the thing I would have told you before any of this with complete confidence and zero hesitation. I live alone. Have lived alone since my divorce 7 years ago. My ex-wife, Carol, got the house we'd bought together in the settlement, which was fair. It had been closer to her parents, and she'd done more of the maintenance decisions on it anyway. I found this place 8 months after we finalized everything. A 2-story craftsman-style house in a mid-sized city built in 1948, good bones, some deferred maintenance that the sellers had disclosed honestly and priced accordingly. I did my own inspection on it, naturally. I spent 4 hours going through every inch of it, attic to crawl space, and I found what I expected to find for a house its age, nothing structural, some cosmetic issues. The roof was 3 to 5 years from needing replacement, but not urgent. I knew exactly what I was buying. I settled into it the way you settle into a house when you're alone and there's no one else's preferences to negotiate. The way I wanted the furniture and the kitchen and the back bedroom that I used as an office, all of it exactly as I decided, which was liberating in the particular way that things are liberating when they've cost you something to get. I put work into the house over the years, refinished the floors, updated the kitchen, replaced the windows on the north side where the old ones had seal failures and were fogging up. Fixed the roof in the third year when I decided to stop putting it off. The house was mine in the complete way that a house can be yours when you've put that much of yourself into it. My neighbor on the east side was a retired school teacher named Walter Prout, who was 71 and who kept very precise hours and who I had a good relationship with, the kind that residential neighbors can have when they're both private people who respect each other's quiet. We waved. We talked over the fence sometimes on weekend mornings. He'd helped me move my washing machine once and I'd helped him clear a blocked gutter. Good neighbor, solid man. The kind of neighbor you don't appreciate fully until something happens and you realize how much it matters to have someone next door who is steady. On the west side was a rental property that had a series of occupants over the years, none of whom stayed long enough for me to know well. At the time all of this started, there was a young couple in their mid-20s, a woman named Tara who worked at the hospital and her boyfriend, whose name I never got right and eventually stopped trying. They were quiet. They kept the place reasonably maintained. We nodded. We didn't talk much. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand the context. A solid house in a solid neighborhood with solid neighbors. 11 years of accumulated knowledge of the building I lived in. A professional background that made me the least likely person in the world to hear a noise and not explain it. And then the footsteps started. It was October, the 14th specifically, because I remember checking the date on my phone in the first few minutes of confusion when the sound began. The kind of automatic timestamping you do when something disrupts the normal order. I'd been asleep for about 2 hours, which put it at roughly 1 in the morning. I slept lightly, always had the legacy of years of early morning inspections that had trained my body to stay close to the surface of sleep so it could respond to the alarm. I wasn't difficult to wake. What woke me was weight. That's the only word for it. Not a sound exactly, not at first. A sensation of weight. The house responding to something heavy moving across it, the way a structure responds to load, the almost subliminal vibration that travels through joists and rafters and walls and settles in the bones of the building. I'd felt it 1,000 times in houses under inspection. The flex of a floor when you walk on it, the slight give of a structure under distributed weight. I knew what it felt like. This felt like something heavy, moving with a steady rhythm above me. I lay in bed and processed it. My bedroom was on the second floor, the back left room. The ceiling above my bedroom was the underside of the roof deck. Not an attic between me and the roof, not in this section of the house. The roof pitched from the front ridge to the back, and the back section of the second floor had the roof deck as its direct ceiling. A detail I knew precisely because I'd been up in the attic space over the front section during my initial inspection and confirmed the layout. So what I was feeling through my ceiling was whatever was on the roof. My first thought was an animal, large one. Raccoons can get surprisingly heavy, and I'd had raccoons on the roof before years ago before I'd patched the soffit gap they'd been using as a freeway. But raccoons don't walk in a straight, measured, heavy pattern the way what I was hearing was walking. They scurry. They make irregular, quick movements. They don't produce the kind of deliberate, weighted, rhythmic vibration that was moving across my ceiling from front to back. This was moving from front to back, evenly spaced, the way a person walks. I sat up in bed, listened harder. The sound continued, not rushing, not frantic, just steady. One heavy step, a pause, another heavy step, another pause. The weight of it distributed through the structure and coming to me muffled but unmistakable through the ceiling above my head. I counted the steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, a pause. Then it seemed to be moving back toward the front. 1, 2, 3, 4, stop. I got up. I did not turn on the bedroom light, some instinct about not advertising myself. I stood in the dark in my bedroom in my socks and my pajama pants, and I listened to what was happening above my ceiling. The steps had stopped, just silence. The house's regular night vocabulary, the radiator tick, the far-off pipe pressure adjustment, normal things. I stood there for 3 minutes, nothing else. I turned the bedside lamp on, looked at my phone, 1:17 in the morning. I stood there another minute, nothing. I walked through the second floor, turned on lights as I went, nothing looked disturbed. The attic hatch in the front hallway was undisturbed, the pull cord hanging where it always hung. The windows were all locked. I could see from a glance that the hardware on each was set. Nothing wrong. I went back to bed. I lay there and thought about what I'd heard and ran through the explanations. Large bird, possibly a turkey vulture, they'll land on roofs sometimes and can be surprisingly heavy, especially if they're moving slowly. Thermal expansion of the roofing material, though I'd never felt it transmit through the structure as load quite that way. A tree branch that had come into contact with the roof somehow, a new one since I'd last checked, moved by wind. I landed on the bird. Turkey vultures are heavy, they walk slowly and deliberately on flat surfaces, and October is within the range of their migration timing in my region. I told myself bird. I went to sleep. 3 nights later, it happened again. 1:22 in the morning. The same quality of waking, the vibration in the structure before the sound was fully conscious. I lay there this time and listened without moving, wanting to get the full character of it before I sat up. Same pattern, heavy, even, front to back. Then what seemed like a longer pause, then back to front. The steps were deliberate and widely spaced, which I estimated as a stride length longer than a normal human walking pace, longer than mine, and I'm 6 feet 2. Longer stride, heavier than a person my size would produce. I got up and went to the window that faced the front yard, looked out. Street light, my front yard, the quiet street, Walter's darkened house to the right. I moved to the window in the upstairs hallway that faced the backyard. My yard, the fence, the alley beyond the fence, dark and still. I went outside. I'm telling you this knowing how it sounds. I'm a 53-year-old professional man who went outside in his pajamas at 1 in the morning to look at his own roof. And I did it because it was the rational thing to do. You hear something on your roof, you check your roof. I stood in the front yard in October with the cold grass wet under my socks and looked up at the front slope of the roof. Nothing, no bird, no branch in contact with the shingles, no large animal. The roof was empty. The shingles were dark and still and slightly reflective with the dew that had already settled on them in the cold night air. I went around the back, same thing, empty roof, clean surface, nothing there. I went back inside, stood in the entryway and thought about it. The steps had stopped when I got out of bed, I realized. I couldn't be sure exactly when they'd stopped, but they were gone by the time I'd gotten to the front window, which was perhaps 45 seconds after I'd gotten up. I wrote it off. I made myself write it off. I made a note on my phone to go up on the roof that weekend and check the surface, look for evidence of animal activity. Claw marks, droppings, a worn path on the shingles. I told myself I would find the explanation and that would be that. That weekend I went up on the roof. I've had my own extension ladder for years, part of the standard homeowner toolkit when you're a property inspector and you know how much contractors charge for things you can do yourself. I set the ladder against the front gutter, clipped my work boots and a headlamp and went up on a clear Saturday morning. I walked the entire roof surface, the full pitch, front ridge to back. I looked for every kind of evidence I knew how to look for. Claw marks on the shingles, feather traces, animal droppings, any depression or pattern in the surface that might indicate repeated transit. The roof was clean. The shingles were in good shape. The ones I'd had redone 6 years ago were still holding well, no granule loss, no buckling. The flashing around the chimney was tight. The ridge cap was intact. There was nothing on that roof, not a track, not a scrape, not a single thing that said any living animal had walked on that surface in recent memory. I came down the ladder in the October morning sun and stood in my driveway and thought about that. A clean roof, no evidence of anything. But I had felt the weight of something up there twice, felt it in my bones through the ceiling joists, felt it the way you feel a heavy person walking across a floor above you in a building. Real weight, real movement, real steps. I told Walter about it that morning over the back fence. I told it as a house question, a structural puzzle, the kind of thing two homeowners discuss without embarrassment. I described the sound, the pattern, the timing. He looked at me for a moment, then he said, "I've heard it." I said, "What?" He said, "From my side, sometimes late at night, I hear something on your roof." I stood there and processed that. He said, "Thought it was raccoons." I said, "No trace of anything on the surface, I just came down." He said, "Huh." I said, "How many times have you heard it?" He said, 3 or 4, maybe 5. I said, "Same time of night?" He said, "Always late. I'm up sometimes for my back, can't sleep, and it's always in the middle of the night. Never heard it in daylight." Always in the middle of the night. I said, "Did you hear it last Tuesday?" He said, "I don't know what night it was, but yeah, sometime in the last week or so." I thanked him and went inside and stood in my kitchen and thought about what two separate people independently hearing something on a roof meant, and why that something left no physical trace, and why it only moved after midnight. I still had the professional explanation. I was still holding on to it. Animals can be clean, birds especially. A large bird landing, walking a few passes, taking off might leave minimal trace, especially if the shingles were relatively new and firm. The timing was harder to explain but not impossible. Some birds are genuinely nocturnal, Owls land on roofs, large owls. I went to my computer and looked up the weight of a great horned owl, 2 to 5 pounds, nowhere near heavy enough to produce the vibration I'd felt. I looked up herons, 6 to 8 pounds, still not enough. I looked up the largest birds commonly found in my region. Nothing I found could account for the weight signature I'd experienced. I sat back in my chair and rubbed my face and thought. Then I thought about the cameras. I had a security camera system. Had installed it 4 years ago after there was a string of car break-ins on our street. Nothing sophisticated, just a few cameras covering the driveway and the front approach. 2 cameras in front, 1 in the back covering the yard and the back of the house. The back camera was mounted under the eave on the southwest corner of the house, angled to cover the yard, but its field of view included the lower back slope of the roof. I'd been pulling footage only when something specific triggered a review. I hadn't thought to check the footage from the nights I'd heard the sounds. I went back in the system and pulled up the footage from the night of October 14th, 1 in the morning, 15 minutes around when I'd heard the sounds. The yard was still, the back fence was still, the alley was still. The back slope of the roof was still, and empty and dark. I watched the timestamp tick through the window of time when I'd been lying in my bed listening to weight move across that surface, and the camera showed me nothing. A dark, empty roof, undisturbed. I checked the night 3 days later. The same. The camera showed me nothing while I had been feeling something move across the roof above me. I sat in my office in front of the monitor and looked at the footage and felt something shift in my understanding of the situation. Not a dramatic shift, not the kind you describe in a movie, not the realization struck like lightning version. More like the feeling when a component you've been testing keeps coming back negative and you realize the problem isn't where you've been looking. The quiet, methodical, professional recalibration of a man who has just run out of the obvious explanations. I bought 2 more cameras that week. I mounted them myself, 1 on each side of the chimney, angled to cover the full front and full back slope of the roof, respectively. The mounting was a little improvised but solid. I used roofing screws with waterproof mounts and ran the cables under the ridge cap. I had full roof coverage now, front and back. Whatever went on that roof surface, I would have it on video. I checked the camera placement on a Monday evening. I looked at the live feeds from my laptop and confirmed the angles were good, that the entire roof surface of both slopes was covered. I noted the timestamp. I made sure the system was recording continuously to the hard drive rather than relying on motion triggers, because I wanted to catch everything regardless of whether the motion detection registered. The footsteps came back Thursday night. 1:08 in the morning, I was up immediately, sitting in bed, processing the vibration in the ceiling. The same pattern, heavy, even, the long stride, moving from east to west across the back slope. Then a pause, longer than usual this time. Then moving again, then stopping. I stayed in bed. I made myself stay in bed. I looked at my phone and watched the timestamp, and I did not move because I wanted whatever was up there to be on camera, and I was afraid that if I got up and went to the window, I would somehow interrupt it the way I had both times before. I lay there for 9 minutes. The footsteps went through 2 full passes, front to back and back to front on the roof above me, and then stopped. I lay there another 10 minutes of silence. Then I got up and went to my office and opened the camera feeds. I pulled up the back slope camera. The timestamp I was watching was 1:08 through 1:23. I watched the footage at regular speed. The roof was empty, the entire 15-minute window, dark shingles, the chimney stack at the far end, the light from the street lamp catching the surface faintly. Nothing moved on that surface. Nothing was there. I pulled up the front slope camera, same 15-minute window, empty, still nothing. I sat in my office at 1:30 in the morning and looked at two camera feeds showing me a roof that nothing was on, and I thought about the weight I had felt in the structure of my house moving across that roof, and I did not have an explanation. That was the moment the professional part of me sat down and stopped talking. Not permanently, it would come back. It always came back, looking for the mundane answer, running the new variables, trying configurations. But for that moment at 1:30 in the morning in my office with the camera feeds open on my laptop, it sat down. And in the silence it left, something else stood up. Something older. Something that had been waiting politely at the back of the room all this time while the professional part held the floor. The older thing looked at the footage of the empty roof and the two sets of timestamps and the memory of weight moving through the bones of my house, and it said, quietly, without drama, "You don't know what this is." That was the first time in 11 years that a house had said something to me that I couldn't answer back. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in my office and I thought about things very carefully, and I made a list of what I knew. I knew the sounds were real. I knew they were consistent in their timing and their pattern. I knew they were felt in the structure as load, as actual physical weight. I knew a neighbor had independently heard them. I knew my cameras showed nothing on the roof during the exact windows when the sounds occurred. I knew the roof surface showed no physical evidence of anything transiting it. I knew all of these things, and they did not fit together into any picture I recognized. I turned off my office light and I sat in the dark and I listened to the house. The radiator tick, the pipe pressure adjustment, the insulation settling in the attic, all the ordinary sounds of a structure I knew by heart. And somewhere underneath all of them, in the memory of my body, if not in the actual present moment, the weight, moving across the ceiling above my bedroom, heavy, patient, evenly spaced. Like something that knew exactly where it was going. Like something that had been there before. The next 2 weeks were the weeks where I tried to be systematic about it. I want to be careful about how I tell this part because it's important that you understand I was not becoming unhinged or irrational. I was doing what I do. I was applying the process I'd applied to hundreds of houses, which is gather data, eliminate explanations one by one, follow what remains. I bought a higher quality camera. Not a security camera, but a proper wildlife surveillance camera, the kind used by hunters and naturalists to document animal activity, that works on infrared at night and has a much higher resolution than my existing system. I mounted it on a separate bracket on the ridge, pointed down the back slope with a wide enough angle to capture the entire surface. 3 cameras now on the roof. I ordered a sound meter, the handheld digital kind, accurate to within half a decibel. I wanted to document the audible component of the events in real numbers. I placed it in the upstairs hallway, which ran along the back of the second floor directly below the section of roof where the sounds seemed most concentrated. I kept a log, date, time, duration, pattern, intensity as best I could estimate it, and any deviations from the established pattern. October 22nd, 1:14 a.m., duration approximately 11 minutes, standard pattern east to west, pause west to east, stop, intensity same as previous events, camera footage nothing on roof, sound meter I checked it in the morning. It had not triggered, which meant whatever sound the steps produced had not been picked up by the meter in the hallway. That was interesting. The sound meter had not triggered. The steps I was feeling in the structure, the vibration I was feeling as weight moving across the roof, were producing no audible signature in the adjacent room. Footsteps that could be felt but not heard from one room over. Footsteps that cameras couldn't see. I noted it in the log and thought about it. Sound transmission through structures is complicated. You can feel vibration in joists that doesn't produce a sound wave that a meter in an adjacent space would register. This is technically possible, but the footsteps I was hearing were not subtle. They were heavy. They came through my ceiling directly, and I heard them clearly in my bedroom. The fact that a meter in the hallway wasn't picking up a sound wave while I was hearing sound through the ceiling joists above me was strange. Like the sound was moving inside the structure of the house rather than through the air. Like it was traveling through the building material itself, not radiating outward into the rooms. I'm a property inspector. I know how sound moves through buildings. That's not how sound moves through buildings. I called my friend Dennis on a Saturday morning. Dennis is the kind of friend I've had since we were both starting out in the inspection business. Now runs his own company, and is the closest thing I have to a peer who would understand the technical aspects of what I was trying to describe without needing everything explained from the beginning. I told him what was happening. I told him about the sounds, the pattern, the weight I was feeling, the cameras showing nothing, the sound meter not triggering. I told him all of it without editorializing, just the data points. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You check your attic recently." I said, "The front section. The rear section doesn't have an attic. The ceiling is the underside of the roof deck." He said, "Ceiling joists good. No delamination in the deck." I said, "I was up on the surface 6 days ago. Everything looks sound." He said, "Thermal expansion can move through a structure in weird ways this time of year. Temperature drop in October, old houses do odd things." I said, "I know thermal expansion. This isn't that. This has stride length. This has weight distribution consistent with a bipedal gait." A pause. He said, "You're not saying what I think you're saying." I said, "I'm not saying anything. I'm describing what the data points tell me." He said, "A camera system showing nothing." I said, "3 cameras, full coverage." He said, "And you feel weight in the structure?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Have you considered that maybe something's wrong with you and not the house?" I said, "Walter heard it too." Another pause, longer. He said, "I'll come have a look." Dennis came on a Sunday. He spent 3 hours in my house, the professional version of a visit where someone is testing your story against the reality of the physical space. He went up on the roof himself. He checked my camera placement and angles. He looked at my log. He stood in my bedroom while I described where I'd been lying and which direction the steps seemed to come from. He sat in my office and watched the footage from the 3 events I'd recorded. When he was done, he sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I'd made and looked at the table surface for a while. I said, "Well," he said, "I can't find anything wrong with your roof or your structure." I said, "And the cameras?" He said, "The coverage is good. You'd see a cat up there, you'd definitely see a person." I said, "So?" He said, "So I don't know." That was the first time Dennis had ever said that to me about a house problem. "I don't know" is not in the working vocabulary of a property inspector. "I don't know" means you haven't looked hard enough yet, go back and look harder. You don't say "I don't know," you say "I haven't found it yet." He said it, and then he drank his coffee and didn't say anything else for a while, and I sat across from him, and we were 2 professionals who had run out of professional answers sitting at a kitchen table on a Sunday morning. He said before he left, "Document everything. Keep the log going. If this changes in any way, if the pattern changes or the timing changes or the frequency changes, note it." I said, "What do I do with the documentation?" He said, "I don't know yet, but you'll want to have it." He drove away and I stood in my driveway and watched him go, and then I went back inside and I updated the log. The frequency changed in the first week of November. Up until that point, it had been every 3 to 4 days, consistent enough to establish a pattern but not constant. The 3rd week of October had given me 3 events in 8 days. Then the 2-week systematic phase had added 4 more. In the 1st week of November, I had 3 events in 5 days. Then the 2nd week of November, I had 5 events in 7 days. The pattern was the same in each one. The same steps, the same timing, the same 1 in the morning window, the same east to west and west to east passes, the same empty roof on every camera, the same non-triggering of the sound meter, the same feeling of weight in the bones of the house above me. But it was happening more often. I noted it in the log and thought about what it meant. In my professional framework, increasing frequency of an occurrence in a structure usually indicates a worsening condition. A settlement crack that was widening, a water intrusion that was spreading, a pest infestation that was growing. Something was progressing. Something was getting worse or more established or more present. I did not say the word haunted. I wanted to be clear about that. I did not use that word in my log. I did not use it in my thinking about the situation. I did not say it to Dennis or Walter or anyone. I was a property inspector. We don't use that word. We use words like unexplained phenomenon and structural anomaly and persistent occurrence of unknown origin. We use clinical language because the clinical language keeps the professional brain engaged and the other brain at a distance. But on the night of November 11th, the professional brain took a significant hit. November 11th was a Wednesday. I'd had an inspection that day across town, a newer build with some sloppy contractor work that I'd spent 6 hours documenting in detail, and I'd come home tired and eaten dinner and fallen asleep earlier than usual, around 10:30. I was deeply asleep when the steps started, not my usual light sleep, and they came into my consciousness slowly, pulling me up from somewhere deeper than I usually went. I was aware of them for what I estimate was 2 or 3 minutes before I was fully awake. And in that window, in the half-dream state between sleep and waking, the quality of the sound was different. Not different in character, same weight, same rhythm, same pattern. Different in the sense that I could hear something else inside them, layered under the weight and the rhythm, something I couldn't have named. I was fully awake in my dark bedroom, and the steps were moving east to west above me, and I was lying on my back looking at my ceiling and thinking, there is something wrong with the sound tonight, and trying to identify what it was. Then I realized what it was. And when I realized it, my hands went cold, the fast, specific cold that's not temperature but adrenaline. The steps were uneven. Not in their timing, the rhythm was still measured, but in their weight. The left step and the right step were not the same. One was heavier than the other, significantly heavier. The way someone walks when they have an injury, when they're favoring one side, when the weight is not distributed equally between 2 feet. The way a person walks. Not the way an animal moves, not the way a structural sound distributes through a building. The specific, individual, asymmetric weight pattern of a particular person's gait. A gait I did not recognize, a gait that did not belong to any person who should have been on my roof. I lay in my bed in the dark and listened to the specific uneven gait of something unknown moving across the ceiling above me, and I did not get up. For the first time since the events began, I did not get up. I lay completely still with the covers pulled up to my chest, and I listened, and I counted the steps, and I noted the weight differential, and I felt the old brain, the one that had been waiting politely at the back of the room since October, move to the front of the room and stand there without saying a word. The steps made 2 passes, then they stopped. I lay there for 20 minutes after they stopped before I turned on my bedside lamp. The light made the room ordinary again. The familiar shapes of the furniture, the window with the curtain I'd had for 4 years, the photograph on the dresser of my son at his college graduation, everything exactly where it had always been. Ordinary, my house, my room, the same room I'd been sleeping in for 11 years. But the ceiling above me was not ordinary anymore. The ceiling above me had something on the other side of it that I could not explain, that my cameras could not see, that my sound meter could not hear, that had an uneven gait like a specific person I did not know, and that was coming more often. I thought about my son. He was 26 and lived in a different city and called every Sunday. I thought about what I would say if he asked how I was, and the honest answer was, there's something on my roof that I can't see and can't explain, and it comes in the night and walks above me in a pattern I'm starting to recognize. I didn't think I would say that. I thought I would say fine and ask about his week and not say any of what was actually happening. I turned off the lamp eventually and lay in the dark and thought about what I was going to do. I had documented everything. I had the camera footage, all of it, every event showing nothing. I had the log with dates and times and durations and observations. I had Dennis's professional assessment that the roof and structure were sound. I had Walter's independent corroboration that he'd heard the sounds. What I did not have was any framework for what I was documenting. I lay in the dark and I thought about the houses I'd inspected over 15 years. I thought about all the people who had started a conversation with me saying, I know this probably has an explanation, but I thought about how I'd always found the explanation. Every time. The settlement and the animals and the pipes and the thermal expansion and the HVAC irregularities and the family of squirrels in the wall cavity. I thought about whether I'd been right to dismiss all of those stories as easily as I had. Whether the confidence with which I'd always produced the rational explanation had been the product of genuine understanding or just of not knowing where to look. I lay in my bed in my house that I knew by heart and I thought, what if some of them didn't have the explanation I gave them? What if some of the people I'd told to stop worrying about a sound had been right to worry about the sound? What if the professional certainty I'd offered to 100 different homeowners over 15 years had been the wrong kind of help? That was a bad road and I knew it was a bad road and I pulled myself off it because you can't do anything useful with that kind of spiral and I focused instead on the practical. What was the next step? What was the next thing to document or eliminate or try? I thought about the gap in my camera coverage. The 3 cameras covered the roof surface. They showed me the outside of the roof, but nothing was showing up on the outside. What if the question wasn't what was on the outside of the roof, but what was between the outside and the inside? What if there was a space I hadn't checked? I'd said the rear section of the second floor had the roof deck as its direct ceiling with no attic space above it. I'd said that because that was what my initial inspection had shown me, what the architectural logic of the house's pitch and layout indicated, what I'd confirmed when I'd been in the front attic section and looked back and saw the rear section's ceiling joists going up to the deck with no space between. But had I put a tape measure on it? Had I actually measured the distance between my bedroom ceiling and the roof surface? I got up, I put my robe on and I went to the garage and I got my 25-foot tape measure and I went outside in the dark with a flashlight and I measured. I stood at the back of the house and I measured the height of the exterior wall from ground to the soffit line. I measured the position of my bedroom window from the ground. I went back inside and measured the height of my bedroom ceiling from the floor. I did the math. The numbers didn't work out the way I expected them to. There was approximately 14 inches between my bedroom ceiling and the roof surface, based on the exterior measurements that the interior measurements didn't account for. 14 inches, not nothing, not an attic you could walk in, but not the 0 inches I'd been assuming for 11 years. I sat down at my kitchen table at 2:15 in the morning with a tape measure and a flashlight, and I looked at the numbers again. 14 inches, a gap, a space inside my house that I had never inspected, had never opened, had never accessed. A space that ran the length of the rear section of the second floor directly above my bedroom. I went back upstairs and looked at the ceiling of my bedroom. Smooth plaster, the old kind, with the irregular texture that mass production can't quite fake. 11 years I'd looked at that ceiling. I'd never thought about what was above it. I went to the hallway, looked at the ceiling there. Same plaster, same texture. I was looking for an access point and I could not find one. There was no hatch in the bedroom ceiling, no hatch in the hallway. I went room to room through the second floor. The bathroom, the second bedroom that I used as a guest room, the room at the front I used as my office. Nothing. I went to the front attic section, opened the attic hatch, pulled down the folding stairs. I went up with my flashlight. I'd been up here plenty of times over the years. It was where I kept a few boxes of things I was not ready to throw away and had no other place to store. Standard attic space over the front half of the house, fiberglass insulation between the floor joists, the sloped ceiling following the roof line. I went to the back wall of the attic, the wall that separated the front attic space from whatever was above my bedroom. There was a wall there, plywood the old kind, not drywall. Plywood with the texture of age on it, the slight grayish color of wood that's been in an unventilated space for decades. And at the base of it, barely visible because it was low and the insulation was pushed up against it, a small rectangular section that was not flush with the rest of the plywood. A panel approximately 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, the dimensions of something you could squeeze through if you needed to and weren't particularly large. I crouched in front of it with my flashlight. The edges of the panel were not fastened from the attic side. There were no screws visible, no nails. It was sitting in place, fitted into a frame, but not secured. I put my hand flat against it. The wood was cold and dry under my palm. Old. The house was built in 1948. This plywood had probably been here since the late 40s or early 50s, a service access to the rear plenum space, the kind of thing builders included for ductwork access or structural inspection that later generations of owners forgot about. I sat back on my heels and looked at the panel, and thought about what my tape measure had told me. 14 inches of space, running the length of the back half of the second floor, above my bedroom, above the hallway, above whatever part of the rear section. 14 inches was not enough for a person to stand, but it was enough to crawl. It was enough to move on hands and knees. It was enough to move across the space above my bedroom ceiling in a pattern that would transmit through the joists as footsteps. Someone who knew this panel was here. Someone who had been coming into my attic, moving the panel, going through into the space above my bedroom and walking. The coldness I felt then was not the adrenaline cold. It was slower. It was deeper. It was the cold that comes when a thing that was frightening because it was unexplainable becomes frightening in a different and more immediate way. The shift from supernatural dread to the visceral animal understanding that a person, an actual person, had been in the bones of my house while I lay in my bed below them. I reached forward and I pulled the panel out. The space behind it was dark. My flashlight hit it and showed me the underside of the roof deck, the floor joists of the rear section ceiling, the narrow 14-inch channel running back into the dark. Old insulation on the joist floors, the older pink fiberglass kind compressed with age, dust. The faintly sweet smell of old wood and dry insulation and years of closed air. And something else. A smell I didn't expect, something organic, something that had been there recently enough to still be present in the air. I held the flashlight steady and looked into the space, and the beam showed me the channel running back about 15 feet to where the roof pitched down to meet the far wall. And in that 15 feet of dark, narrow space, I could see the impressions in the old insulation. Indentations in the insulation running in two parallel lines the approximate distance of hands and knees placement. A track, the record of something moving through this space on all fours back and forth repeatedly. The insulation was old and the impressions were clear. Not one set of impressions. Many sets overlaid the accumulation of repeated transit. Whatever had been moving through this space had been doing it many times. Had been doing it for longer than October. I sat in the attic mouth of that panel, opening with my flashlight and my heart doing something loud and fast in my chest. And I thought about all the nights I'd slept in the room below this channel and hadn't heard it. All the nights before October 14th when the events had begun. All the years, potentially, of something in this space that I hadn't known about. The smell was stronger when I held still. I'd cataloged it in the first second as organic and recent, but now I was identifying it more specifically. Not an animal smell, not the musk of a raccoon or the sharp smell of a squirrel, something else. Something that reminded me of the cold and the outdoors, and something else underneath. Something that my brain was trying to put a name to and not quite getting there. I backed out of the attic without going into the space. I went downstairs, I went to my phone, and I called 911. The dispatcher was calm and professional and asked me to describe the situation, and I told her I believed someone had been accessing a hidden space in my house, that I had physical evidence of repeated access through a concealed panel in my attic, and that I was concerned about an active intruder. She told me to leave the house and wait outside until a unit arrived. I left the house. I stood in my driveway in my robe in the November dark and waited. The street light was yellow and steady. Walter's house was dark. The rental on the other side was dark. The night was cold and very still, and the roof of my house was visible from where I stood, the dark shingles, the chimney, the ridge cap against the sky. Empty still, the same roof I'd looked at from this spot a dozen times since October. Empty. The police came, 2 officers. I walked them through the situation without any editorializing, the same way I'd walked Dennis through it, just data. The footsteps, the pattern, the camera footage showing nothing, the tape measure math, the attic panel, the impressions in the insulation. They went into the attic with their own flashlights. They were in there for a while. I waited on the landing below the attic hatch and listened to them moving around. One of them came back to the hatch and looked down at me. He said, "You see this panel regularly." I said, "I didn't know it existed until tonight." He said, "The space behind it's been used a lot." I said, "I know." He said, "We're going to need to look through more carefully. Is there anything else in the house that might access this space?" I said, "I don't believe so. I've never found another access point." He said, "Okay, wait downstairs, please." I went downstairs and I sat at my kitchen table and I looked at my hands on the table surface and I thought about 11 years in this house. I thought about every night I'd lain in my bed below that space. I thought about the smell in that channel, the organic recent smell that my brain had been trying to name. It came to me sitting at my kitchen table at 2:45 in the morning. The smell was of a person, the specific compound of skin and breath and body warmth that a person leaves behind in an enclosed space. Not unwashed, not foul, just human, the ambient signature of a body that had been in that space repeatedly over time. Someone had been living in that space, not moving through it occasionally, living in it. The accumulation of impressions in the insulation was not the mark of occasional transit. It was the mark of repeated habitation. Something in that channel had been in there enough times for long enough to compress the old insulation under a regular path. I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about the cameras showing nothing. And I thought about the angle of the cameras which were mounted to cover the roof surface. And I thought about the channel which was inside the roof structure, between the deck and the ceiling, not on the roof, not visible from outside, not visible to any camera that was looking at the exterior surface. The cameras had shown me nothing because whatever was making the footsteps had never been on the exterior of the roof. It had always been inside the 14 inches of space between my bedroom ceiling and the underside of the roof deck. Moving on hands and knees through the channel, the weight of it transmitting down through the joists as the footstep vibration I'd been feeling for weeks. Not on the roof. In the roof. The officers were in my house for 2 hours. They went through the attic carefully. They documented the impressions. They noted the smell which both of them recognized as I had, the smell of a person in an enclosed space. They found other things. I will tell you what they found because it's important. But I want to say first that when the older of the two officers came down from the attic and sat across from me at my kitchen table and started talking, I saw something in his face that I had not expected to see in the face of a police officer who had probably seen a lot of things. He looked like a man who was choosing his words very carefully. He said, "The channel runs the length of the back section of the second floor. It's been accessed through the panel in the front attic, which shows signs of regular use. The edges of the panel are worn in a way consistent with repeated removal and replacement by hand." I said, "Okay." He said, "We found a section near the east end of the channel above what I think is your bedroom where the material in the space has been disturbed in a more significant way. There's evidence of habitation, meaning items were in that space. Food packaging, a water container, some cloth material." I said, "Someone was living up there." He said, "It appears that way. We've got the space cordoned and we're going to do a full forensic examination tomorrow." I said, "How long? How long do you think they were up there?" He said, "I can't say for certain, but the dust patterns around the items and the level of compression in the insulation suggests an extended period. Months, possibly longer." I said, "How did they get in?" He said, "We're still working on that. The front attic hatch was the access to the panel, but you'd need to get into the attic first. Is that hatch locked?" I said, "There's a latch from inside. I latch it from inside when I close it. If it's latched, it can't be opened from outside." He said so they either had access when the hatch was unlatched, or there's another entry point we haven't found yet. He said there's one more thing I need to tell you. I looked at him. He said in the east section of the channel near where the habitation items were found, there are holes. I said holes. He said small ones, drilled through the ceiling material down through the plaster into the room below, positioned in a way that would give a view of the room from above. He said your bedroom. I sat at my kitchen table at 4 in the morning and I thought about that. Small holes drilled through my ceiling, looking down into my bedroom from the space above where someone had been living. For months, possibly longer. I thought about 11 years in this house. I thought about the things you do in your bedroom, the private, unremarkable, intimate things that you do in the room where you sleep because you think you're alone. I thought about every version of those things I'd done in that room for 11 years. I thought about October 14th, the first night I'd heard the footsteps. And I thought, what changed on October 14th? What changed so that I suddenly heard the weight of someone moving in the space above me when presumably that weight had been there before without me noticing? And I thought maybe nothing changed. Maybe I had been hearing it before in the category of structural sounds that I'd filed away under thermal expansion or settlement and hadn't brought it to conscious attention. Maybe the reason October 14th was the first time I'd consciously registered it was not because it started on October 14th, but because something about that particular night's movement had been loud enough or close enough to my head, or at a frequency that my brain couldn't file away as structural sound. Maybe the first night had not been the beginning. The officer was still talking. I pulled myself back to the table to the present. He was saying something about a forensic team in the morning and me needing to find somewhere else to stay for the next day or two and victim support services. I registered all of it from behind a layer of something that I can only describe as the specific numbness that comes from having understood something that you cannot ununderstand. I said, "Did you find who it was?" He said, "Not yet. We have forensic material that will help identify. We're also looking at whether there are any missing persons cases that might connect." I said, "Missing persons." He said, "Someone living in a concealed space in a private residence without the owner's knowledge would typically be someone with no safe housing option. Possibly a missing person. Possibly someone who had been in that situation for an extended time." He said it gently, not accusingly, not provocatively. Just factually, the way you say a difficult thing to someone who needs to hear it factually. I said they had access to my roof from inside, going back and forth in that channel. They could see into my bedroom. He said yes. I said, "And the cameras I put on the roof?" He said they never would have shown anything. The activity was inside the structure. I said, "The sound meter, in the hallway?" He said the space is above the ceiling. The sound was transmitting through structural material, not through air. A meter in the adjacent room measuring airborne sound wouldn't necessarily catch it. I said, so everything I documented, all the footage, all the measurements, all the log. He said it documented that something was happening, it just didn't know where to look. I said I should have found the panel sooner. He said it was a concealed space in a house built in 1948. You're a property inspector and you missed it in your own house. That's not a failure, that's a very good concealment. I thought about that. A very good concealment. Plywood panel, no fasteners on the attic side, fitting its frame so cleanly that you'd have to be looking for it specifically to find it. A craftsman's work. The kind of access panel built into a structure by someone who understood structures. Built in by someone who knew houses. I went to Walter's house. It was 6 in the morning and I knocked on his door until he answered it, which took 4 minutes. And when he opened the door in his bathrobe with his white hair and his 71-year-old face working through the surprise of an early morning knock, I stood on his porch and I said, "How long have you really been hearing the sounds?" He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "Come inside." We sat at his kitchen table and he made coffee and he told me he'd been hearing sounds from my roof for much longer than 3 to 5 times. He'd been hearing them intermittently since the previous winter, 8 months. He'd assumed raccoons. He'd assumed I knew about it, that it was something I was dealing with in my own time. He'd mentioned it the Saturday I asked him because I'd asked directly and he'd been honest, but he'd scaled down how many times he'd heard it because he hadn't wanted to alarm me. 8 months. Whatever had been in that channel had been there for at least 8 months that could be corroborated from an external source. I sat at Walter's kitchen table and drank his coffee and looked out his window at the side of my house. The ordinary craftsman exterior, the old siding I'd repainted 3 years ago, the window of my bedroom visible from this angle. He said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Not especially." He said, "Do they know who it was?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I don't know yet." He said, "You can stay here. If you need to not be in the house, you can stay here." I looked at him, 71 years old and steady as a wall and offering me his house without hesitation, and I thought about what good neighbors actually are, not the fence conversations and the occasional help with the washing machine. But this, the offer made without ceremony in a kitchen at 6 in the morning. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Stay as long as you need." I stayed 3 nights. The forensic team did their work. They found enough material in the channel to make identifications. I'm not going to tell you everything they found or everything they concluded, because some of it is not mine to tell and some of it I was not officially informed of and some of it I'm still not certain I've processed completely. What I can tell you is what the detective who was assigned to the case told me on the 3rd day. The space had been accessed through a secondary entry point that the initial search had missed, not the attic hatch. A loose section of soffit on the north side of the house near the chimney that someone had worked loose over a period of time from the outside. A person could get onto the roof from a ladder at the north side of the house, access the soffit opening, and from there reach the channel through a gap in the structural framing above the exterior wall. It would require someone who understood how the house was built, Someone who had assessed the structure carefully enough to find its vulnerability. The forensic evidence suggested that whoever had been in the space had been there not continuously but regularly. The word the detective used was habitually, returning habitually over an extended period. There were fingerprints, there were trace materials. There were the holes through my bedroom ceiling, which were determined to have been made with a small hand drill and covered with a material that would have been invisible from below. A thin patch of plaster compound that matched the surrounding surface closely enough that you would have to be looking for it to see it. I had not been looking for it. The detective told me they had a person of interest. She did not tell me who. She said the investigation was ongoing. She said I might be contacted for additional information. She said, "One thing I want to ask you directly." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "The footsteps you were hearing, the sounds that you started noticing in October, is there a reason you think they became audible at that point when they apparently hadn't been before?" I said, "I've thought about that. I think the channel is worst acoustically directly above my bedroom headboard. I moved the bed in September. I'd been rearranging the room. I moved the headboard from the south wall to the north wall, which puts it directly below the section of the channel where the habitation material was found. I think I was simply in a different position relative to the source." She wrote something down. She said, "You moved your bed in September and started hearing the sounds in October." I said, "Yes." She said, "And before that?" I said, "Before that I was sleeping against the other wall. The sounds were probably the same or similar, but I wasn't close enough to the source to register them distinctly. My professional classification system probably caught them and filed them as structural noise without bringing them to conscious attention." She said, "Your professional classification system." I said, "I'm a property inspector. I hear a lot of house sounds. I have a mental taxonomy for them. I think I was filing the sounds without knowing what I was filing." She looked at me for a moment and said, "That's a useful thing to know." I said, "I'm not sure if useful is the word I'd use." She said, "You weren't imagining it. I want to make sure you know that. Everything you documented, the log, the camera footage, the observations, it all corroborates what we found physically. You were hearing something real and you tried to understand it with the tools you had." I said the tools I had weren't the right ones. She said, "That's not a failure. That's just what it is when you don't know what you're dealing with yet." I went back to my house on day 4. The officers were done with it. The soffit entry point had been sealed with a structural fix that I'd done myself on the morning they cleared it, because standing still was not something I was able to do, and having a job to do with my hands was better than not having one. The attic panel had been resecured with fasteners from the attic side. The holes in my bedroom ceiling had been documented photographically and then filled by a plasterer I'd called in, and the patch was good. You couldn't see it now. The surface was smooth and matched the surrounding texture. I had repainted the section of ceiling, fresh paint. The room smelled like it. Paint and my house and the autumn cold coming through the window I'd cracked open to air it out while the paint dried. I stood in my bedroom doorway on day 4 and looked at the ceiling. Smooth, clean, repainted. The holes that had been there were gone. But I knew where they had been. I knew the approximate positions. I could look at the ceiling and place them, the locations where someone had drilled through from above and looked down into my room while I slept. I could look at the ceiling and feel the specific quality of that knowledge, which has no clean name but is something like being seen without your knowledge while you thought you were alone. The violation of a boundary you didn't know existed in a space you thought was entirely yours. My house, 11 years, the house I knew by heart. I stood in the doorway and I thought about the professional certainty I'd carried through 15 years of work and how it had failed me in the most important way possible, which was in my own home, in my own bedroom, in the bones of the building that I was supposed to know better than anyone. I thought about the families I'd stood in front of over the years and told, confidently, that the sound they were worried about had an explanation. I thought about the ones who had looked at me with relief when I said that, the tension going out of their shoulders, the decision to trust the professional assessment over their own unease. I thought about whether I'd ever missed something the way I'd missed the panel in my own attic. I hope not, I genuinely hope not. But hope and certainty are different rooms in the same house, and I've had to accept that I can't always guarantee which room I'm in. I moved the bed back to the south wall that first night, not because I thought it would make a difference, not because I was afraid of the sounds, because there would be no sounds now, the space was sealed and what had been there was gone. I moved the bed because I wanted to change the room. I wanted to sleep in a different position than I had when there had been something above me that I hadn't known about. Small maybe, irrational probably, but real. I lay in the bed in the new position, and I looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was just a ceiling now, plaster and paint. Old house material from 1948, irregular and textured and familiar. I knew every inch of it. Except now I also knew what was above it, the 14 inches of space. The channel sealed now, the access points closed. The empty space above my bedroom that had not been empty, that had held things and a person and a gaze that came down through holes that were no longer there. I thought about going to sleep. I thought about whether I would hear anything. The house made its ordinary sounds. The radiator tick 7 times before temperature. The pipe pressure adjustment at 2 in the morning. The insulation settling in the front attic in the deep cold. Nothing else. No weight, no steps. No uneven gait moving east to west above me. Just the house, just my house, the one I knew by heart. I lay there for a long time before I slept, and in the space between waking and sleep I felt, very specifically, the difference between knowing a house and knowing everything about a house. And I thought about how those two things are not the same thing. And I thought about how you can live in a place for 11 years and still be wrong about it in a way that matters. And I thought about the smell in the channel, the organic human smell of someone who had been there repeatedly. Why over months? And I thought about the impressions in the old insulation, the overlaid tracks of hands and knees, the accumulated record of a person moving back and forth in the dark above my ceiling while I slept. That was a year ago now. The investigation found its conclusions, and I was informed of them in the way you're informed of such things, through a process that is both thorough and impersonal, and that leaves you with facts in place of understanding. I have facts. I have dates and documentation and a sealed case file and a soffit that is structurally sound. I have a bedroom ceiling that is smooth and clean and shows no sign of what was there. I still do property inspections. I'm good at my job. I still find the explanations that houses are hiding, the settlement cracks and the water intrusions and the HVAC irregularities. I'm thorough, I'm careful. I check the attic access panels now, every one. I measure the spaces I can't see into. I bring a tape measure to every job and I do the arithmetic on the spaces between floors and ceilings, and I make sure the numbers work out the way they're supposed to work out. And when a homeowner says to me, I know this probably has an explanation, but there's this sound we hear sometimes, I don't move as quickly toward the reassurance as I used to. I listen a little longer. I ask more questions. I make sure I know what I'm explaining before I explain it. Because the thing I know now, the thing I know in a way I did not know it before, is that a house can be hiding something in its own structure that the person who knows it best has never thought to look for, and that the absence of a visible explanation is not the same as the absence of something real, and that the sounds you learn to live with are not always the sounds you think they are. I know my house by heart. But the heart of a house has rooms you don't always know about until you find them. And some of them have been occupied for a long time before you think to look. I started checking the ceiling every morning. Not in a dramatic way, not standing in the middle of the room with a flashlight and a measuring tape, though I'd done that too in the early weeks after everything came out, just a glance. The specific, habitual, can't-help-it glance of someone who has learned that a surface they trusted was not what they thought it was. I'd sit up in bed and my eyes would go to the ceiling the way a tongue goes to the gap where a tooth used to be. Automatic, unwanted, there. The ceiling was always just a ceiling. I knew that. I knew it in the rational daylight way you know things that your body hasn't caught up to yet. The soffit entry had been sealed with structural grade material, and I'd done the work myself and I knew it was solid. The attic panel had been fastened from the attic side with 3-inch screws, and I'd checked the screws twice in the first week after I moved back in and they hadn't moved. There was nothing in the channel above my bedroom. The channel was empty, sealed at both ends, nothing going in and nothing coming out. But the glance happened every morning anyway. My eyes didn't ask permission, they just went there. That's the part that nobody tells you about when they talk about violations of this kind. Violations of space and privacy and the basic human expectation that your home is the one place in the world that is fully yours. They tell you about the immediate part, the shock and the investigation and the practical steps of securing the property. They don't tell you about the months afterward when you've done all the practical steps and the space is secured and nothing is wrong and you still can't move through a room you've lived in for 11 years without your body cataloging the evidence of what was there. I know the date of every inspection I did in the months after. I remember them because work was where the professional brain could run properly, could apply its taxonomy and its methodology, and its 15 years of structured thinking to something that had clean edges and an expected outcome. I'd arrive at a house I'd never been in and within an hour I could tell you every significant thing wrong with it. Every structural concern, every moisture issue, every deferred maintenance item that the sellers had either missed or hoped you'd miss. That part of my brain worked perfectly. It worked better than ever, actually sharper and more thorough. because I'd learned from the most uncomfortable possible source that thoroughness had gaps in it. It was at home where the other thing happened. The non-rational, non-professional bodily thing that had no methodology and no expected outcome, and that a 15-year career in structural assessment had given me zero tools to manage. I stopped eating dinner in the kitchen. I couldn't explain it. The kitchen had nothing to do with anything. The channel didn't run over the kitchen. There were no holes in the kitchen ceiling and no reason to feel differently about the kitchen than I ever had. But around the third week, I noticed I was eating at my desk in the office or on the couch, and I hadn't sat at the kitchen table since the night the police had been there. The kitchen table was where I'd sat and been told what was in my ceiling, and my body had made a decision about that table without consulting me. I knew this was not rational. I noted it the same way I'd been noting things in my log for months, adding a new category to the documentation that was less about the house and more about what the house was doing to me. I can look at that log now and see the transition clearly. The shift from technical observations about roof cameras and sound meters to this new section, messier, less precise, the record of a person trying to document their own psychological response to something that professional vocabulary wasn't built to describe. Dennis called every week or so in the first couple of months. He'd ask how I was doing in the particular way that means I know something happened to you and I'm checking in, not the generic social inquiry but the weighted version. I'd tell him I was fine and working and the house was secured, and he'd say good and we'd talk about something else. He never pushed. Dennis is not a person who pushes. He's a person who shows up and offers and waits. He came over in December with a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses, and we sat on my couch and he poured and he said, "Are you going to talk about it?" I said, "I've talked about it plenty. With the police, with the detective, with the victim services person they sent." He said, "I don't mean the facts. You're good at the facts. I mean the rest of it." I said, "What rest of it?" He said, "The part where you can't sit in your kitchen." I looked at him. He said, "You've lived in this house for 11 years. I've been to your kitchen 100 times. You always eat at that table." I said, "I've been busy." He said, "Sure." I poured more bourbon and looked at the living room. The familiar shapes of the furniture I'd chosen, the photograph of my son on the bookshelf, the window with the street outside, a quiet December night, the street light yellow through the glass. I said, "Do you know what the worst part is?" He said, "Tell me." I said, "I can't stop thinking about the fact that I lived here 11 years and didn't know. That's the part I can't put down. Not what happened, not the violation of it, not even the safety piece. The not knowing. The professional who is supposed to know houses, who built a career on understanding structures, who did his own inspection on this house before he bought it, who didn't find a concealed access panel in his own attic." Dennis said, "You weren't looking for that." I said, "That's exactly it. I wasn't looking for that. And that means there are things I'm not looking for, things I've never looked for. In 11 years and hundreds of inspections, what else have I not been looking for?" Dennis was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what you're doing." I said, "What?" He said, "You're making this about professional competence because professional competence is a problem you know how to think about. The other thing is a problem you don't know how to think about, so you're staying on the competence side because at least that has edges. I looked at him. He said just a theory. I said it's a good theory. He said what's the other side? I said what do you mean? He said the competence side I understand. What's the other side of it, the one you keep not thinking about? I looked at the window, the streetlight, December cold visible in the quality of the light. I said someone knew my house better than I did. Someone understood the structure of this building, the layout, the concealed spaces, better than the professional who bought it and inspected it and has lived in it for 11 years. Someone chose this house specifically. Chose it, accessed it, stayed in it repeatedly for months at minimum. And the only time I knew about it was when I moved my bed and accidentally put my head closer to the source of the sound. I said if I hadn't moved the bed, I wouldn't know now. I'd still be living here not knowing. And that's what I can't put down, not what I found out, what I might still not know. Dennis didn't say anything for a long time. He poured more bourbon. We sat in the quiet. He said eventually, the space is sealed. I said the space I know about is sealed. He sat with that. I said I've been through every inch of this house. After the police finished and I moved back in, I spent 2 days going through every room, every wall cavity I could access, every gap in the structure. I measured every space I couldn't see into. I found 3 other spaces in this house that I'd never specifically investigated. 2 of them were what they should be, empty and consistent with the architecture. One of them I couldn't fully access without taking down a wall section, and I nearly did. I had the tools out and everything. He said, but you didn't. I said I didn't because I stood there with the tools out, and I thought about what I was doing, and I realized that if I started taking my house apart looking for things I might have missed, I was going to take it all apart. There's no logical stopping point. Once you know that a house can hide something from the person who knows it best, every space you haven't personally verified becomes a potential problem. That's not a livable way to think about a building. He said, so you stopped. I said I stopped. And I put the tools back and I painted the bedroom ceiling and I sealed the attic panel and I moved the bed and I went back to work. He said, and how's that working out? I said the morning glance at the ceiling is down to once a day. Progress. He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more serious. He said, you want to know what I think? I said, you're going to tell me anyway. He said, I think you should sell the house. I looked at him. He said, I know that's not what you want to hear. I know you've put 11 years into this place and you know it and you've made it yours. But you just told me you can't sit at your kitchen table. You check the ceiling every morning. You're documenting your own psychological state in the same log where you documented footstep patterns. That's a person who is not going to be okay in this house. I said running from it doesn't fix it. He said nobody said anything about fixing it. Some things don't get fixed. They get carried differently when you're not standing in the middle of them. I poured the rest of my bourbon and held the glass and didn't say anything. He said, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see because you asked me here to do exactly that, even if you didn't say that out loud. I said, when did you get so perceptive? He said, I've been around you for 20 years. Some of it was going to absorb. I didn't sell the house. Not immediately, not that winter. I understood Dennis's point and I held it at a distance and I went on doing what I was doing, which was working and maintaining the property and keeping the log and checking the ceiling and slowly, incrementally, learning how to be in my own house again. The detective called in February. She said the case had reached a conclusion she was able to share with me. She asked if she could come by. She came on a Thursday evening and sat in my living room with a folder and a cup of coffee I'd made, and she told me what she could tell me. I'm going to tell you some of it and not all of it, because some of it is about a person whose story is not mine to tell in full, and some of it I was asked to keep confidential as part of the process. What I can tell you is that the person who had been in my house was not a stranger to houses, was not someone who had stumbled across my particular property randomly, was someone who understood structures and had studied this house specifically before accessing it, who had identified the concealed channel and the soffit vulnerability as a viable point of entry. The knowledge required to do what they did was not general knowledge. It was specific, technical, professional knowledge. The detective told me this matter-of-factly. She told me other things too, about the person's situation and background and the circumstances that had led to what they'd done, and I listened to all of it the way you listen when you're receiving information that complicates something you thought you understood. When someone who has violated your space becomes a person with a full biography and a set of circumstances that put them in a channel above your bedroom ceiling, the simple, clean shape of the violation gets complicated. Not excused, not minimized. Complicated. I thought about the smell in the channel. The organic human smell of a body in an enclosed space. I thought about what it would mean to be in that space. 14 inches, just enough to move through on hands and knees, dark, cold in the winter. No toilet, no water, no way to stand upright. The compressed insulation, the worn track of repeated transit. I thought about what it would take for a person to be there. What would have to have gone wrong in a life for a 14-inch channel in someone else's house to be a better option than the alternatives? I'm not saying that it was acceptable. I'm not saying that the holes in my ceiling and the months of being watched in my bedroom were anything other than what they were. I'm saying that sitting in my living room listening to the detective tell me the full picture was not the experience I had been expecting, which was the clean experience of understanding closing around something with clear edges. It was the other kind. The kind where understanding opens out and gets larger and more complicated, and you're left holding more than you started with. The detective said before she left, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "There's one thing I want to understand. The pattern of the footsteps. The east to west movement, the two passes, the consistent timing. Was that intentional? Was there a reason for the pattern?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "From what we can determine, the movement in the channel was for purposes of ventilation management. The space doesn't have any air flow. On cold nights, the body heat and respiration in the channel would have made the air quality poor relatively quickly. Moving through the space helped manage that. The pattern was functional." I said, "Functional?" She said, "Yes. The timing in the early morning hours was probably chosen because that's when the household was most likely to be in deep sleep and least likely to respond to sounds." I said, "Except I'm a light sleeper." She said, "Yes, That appears to have been a variable that wasn't fully accounted for. I said my moving the bed. She said that too. I sat after she left and I thought about functional. The word that had been the most frightening element of the events, the measured, deliberate pattern of the footsteps, the thing that had made my professional brain insist it was analyzing a specific gait, the thing that had finally pushed me to the attic panel at 2 in the morning. All of it functional, cold air management in an enclosed space. Not sinister, not theatrical, not anything other than a body trying to maintain itself in a space that was not designed for a body. That changed the texture of the thing, not the weight of it, but the texture. The weight stayed the same. The weight of knowing that someone had been in the bones of my house for months, watching through holes in my bedroom ceiling, and that I had not known, and that I had slept below that watching without any awareness of it. That stayed exactly the same. But the texture changed, the way the texture of a story changes when you get more of it. Spring came. I kept the log. The log had become something different by then, less a documentation of events and more a kind of thinking out loud, the record of a person trying to find a framework for an experience that didn't fit the frameworks he already had. I'd been writing in it almost daily through the winter, processing things through the act of documenting them, which is something the professional brain understands even when the content is outside its usual jurisdiction. In April, I read the log from the beginning, all of it in one sitting on a Saturday afternoon. The early entries with their technical precision, the measurements and the camera placements, and the observations about weight transmission through structural members. The shift in October, when the pattern established itself clearly enough to force the first real acknowledgement that something was happening. The 2 weeks of systematic documentation, the Dennis visit, the November 11th entry about the uneven gait that had finally made the professional brain sit down. The night of the attic panel, written in the hours after in the specific stripped-down language that comes when something has happened that you haven't yet built the vocabulary to describe fully. And then the winter entries, the kitchen table, the morning ceiling glance, the conversation with Dennis, the detective's visit, all of it. I read it and I thought about the person those entries were written by and whether that person was still who I was or whether I was someone else now. Not dramatically. Not in the way people describe themselves as changed by trauma in the movies, the before and after with a clear line between them. More like the quiet, incremental way that any significant experience changes you, the way you don't notice it happening but you notice the result when you look. I was still a property inspector. I still got up at 6 and drove to houses and went through them methodically and found the things that were hiding. I was still thorough, still professional, still the person who had an answer for every sound. But I was also the person who had written all of those log entries, who had lain in bed listening to functional ventilation movement in the bones of his house and felt, very specifically, the inadequacy of every framework he'd built his working life around. Both of those people were me now. That's what 11 months of living with it had settled into. Not a resolution, not a before and after. Just both things at once, the professional competence and the permanent knowledge of its limits, existing in the same person in the same house on the same ordinary Tuesday morning. I called my son in April. His name is Ryan and he's 27 now and he works in city planning, which means he thinks about buildings too from a different angle. And we have always been able to talk about structural things, about cities and houses and the way built environments shape the people in them and vice versa. I told him the basic facts of what had happened in the fall, not all of it. The version that a father tells a son to make sure the son knows his parent is safe without giving the son everything that would make him worry. The version with the professional vocabulary and the sealed-up conclusion. In April, I called him and I gave him more of the rest of it. Not everything, but more. I told him about the morning ceiling glance. I told him about the kitchen table. I told him about reading the log and thinking about who had written it. He was quiet on the phone for a while. Then he said, "Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "Why didn't you tell me more of this in the fall?" I said, "Because there was nothing you could do about it from where you were, and I was handling it." He said, "I could have come." I said, "I know, I didn't want you to." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because when you're 53 and your son is 26 and something happens to you that you don't have a clean explanation for, there's a particular version of pride that makes you want to have it mostly worked out before you hand it to him. I'm working on that version of pride, but it was strong in the fall." He said, "I'm coming this summer." I said, "Good." He said, "You're okay though. Right now today you're okay." I said, "I'm okay." He said, "You sure?" I said, "Your grandmother used to say that okay is not a destination, it's a direction. I'm pointed that way." He said, "When did Grandma say that?" I said, "I might have made that up, but it sounds like something she'd say." He made the sound he makes when I've said something that amused him slightly more than he wants to admit. Then he said, seriously though, "The house, are you staying?" I said, "I think so, for now. Dennis thinks I should sell it and he might be right and I might eventually agree with him. But right now it still feels like giving something up. Like letting the experience of it define the house instead of the 11 years before it." He said, "That's a reasonable way to think about it." I said, "Or it's stubbornness dressed up as philosophy." He said, "Probably both." I went to the attic in May. Not for any specific purpose. I'd been avoiding it specifically and consciously since the first week after I'd moved back in. I'd been in there twice to check the fasteners on the panel, both times fast, task-focused, in and out. I hadn't stayed. I hadn't let myself actually be in the space. In May, on a warm Saturday morning, I opened the attic hatch and pulled down the folding stairs and I went up and I sat in the attic. The front section of the attic was the same as it had always been. My boxes in their places, the old ones from the divorce, things I'd been keeping without knowing exactly why. The insulation between the floor joists. The sloped ceiling following the pitch of the roof, the smell of old wood and dry air and the specific enclosed warmth that attic spaces have on warm days. The plywood wall at the back, with the panel now fastened shut. I looked at the panel for a while. The screw heads were visible now, 3-inch galvanized deck screws through the panel into the framing, installed by my hands on a night when the detective had cleared the property and I'd needed something to do. They hadn't moved. The panel was exactly as I'd left it. I sat in my attic and I thought about the first time I'd come up here after buying the house, the initial inspection of my own property, the thorough professional assessment that had found the good bones and the deferred maintenance and the roof that needed watching. I thought about sitting up here in that first week and not seeing the plywood panel because I hadn't been looking for it, hadn't known to look. I thought about all the things you don't know to look for until you know they exist. There's a metaphor in that somewhere, and I've been careful not to push it too far because I'm not a person who deals in metaphors professionally, and I don't entirely trust myself with them. But it's there, the gap between what a space shows you and what a space is hiding. The difference between what you can see with a flashlight and what requires a tape measure and some arithmetic to find. The concealed panel that fits its frame so cleanly that you have to be looking for it specifically to see it. I sat in the attic for an hour, just sat. Looked at the space, the familiar and the unfamiliar parts, and let it be the space it was, with its complete history, the long prior history of the house before I owned it and the 11 years of my occupation, and the months of the other presence and the investigation and the ceiling and the months of my avoidance, and now this. This Saturday morning in May with the warm attic smell and the screw heads showing in the plywood panel, and me sitting in my own space being in it instead of managing it. When I came down, I felt different in a way I would describe as less pressurized. Not better exactly, not resolved, just less compressed around the thing. I ate lunch at the kitchen table. That was the first time since October. I made a sandwich and I sat at the table and I ate it. The table was the same table it had always been. The kitchen was the same kitchen. The ceiling was the same ceiling, no holes, solid plaster, the same ceiling I'd had since I moved in. I ate the sandwich and I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard and I thought about ordinary things. The fence needed repainting, the winter had been hard on it. The garden bed was coming back from the cold, some early green showing in the stuff my ex-wife had planted years ago, and that had survived through all the subsequent owners and all the subsequent winters because perennials are stubborn in a way that I find genuinely admirable. I finished the sandwich and I washed the plate and I put it in the drying rack and I went back to work. That was a small thing. That was a very small thing by most measurements. But it was the first ordinary thing I'd done in the kitchen since October, and it felt like the first step of something, the beginning of the reoccupation of a space I'd been ceding to the weight of what had happened there. You take the space back by degrees. I know this now. Not by a decision, not by a deliberate act of will. By the accumulated weight of ordinary actions that fill the space back in with your presence until the thing that happened there is one of the things the space holds rather than the only thing. Summer came. Ryan came for 2 weeks in July. He's taller than me now, has been since he was 17, and he fills a room in the way young men do when they're fully themselves, not self-conscious about the space they take up. He slept in the guest room and we ate at the kitchen table every night, and we went to a game and walked through the neighborhood and had the kind of conversations that fathers and sons have when there's enough space between them to be honest without the proximity making it too loaded. One evening he asked to see the attic. I'd told him more of the details by then, enough that he understood the geography of it, the channel and the panel and the soffit entry and the holes in the ceiling that were no longer there. He asked to see it the way someone asks to see a place they've heard described, with the specific curiosity that comes from having the abstract information and wanting the physical reality to attach it to. We went up. I stood by the hatch and he walked through the front section the way I had in May, taking it in, running his hand along the roof line, bending to look at the panel at the back wall. He stood in front of the plywood panel and looked at the screw heads. He said, "You put those in." I said, "The night the police cleared out." He said, "Same night." I said I needed something to do. He nodded. He stood there a while longer. Then he turned around and looked at the front section of the attic, at the boxes and the slope of the roof and the ordinary attic things. He said, "It's smaller than I expected." I said, "Spaces usually are." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "When you spend a long time thinking about a space, building it in your head, it gets larger than the physical reality. Then you stand in it and it's just a space." He looked at me. I said, "That's not a profound statement, it's just true." He said, "Is it smaller than it felt in October?" I said, "Yes, considerably." He said, "Good." We came down and made dinner together and ate at the kitchen table, and it was ordinary and warm, and I thought about the fact that I had a son who would drive to see me and ask to go up in my attic with me and stand next to me in front of the thing that had scared me most and not make it into anything larger than it was. I thought about what that was worth. I thought about how you don't always know what you have until something puts it in relief. He left on a Saturday morning and I stood in the driveway and watched him drive away the same way I'd watched Dennis drive away last fall. And then I went inside and I stood in the kitchen for a moment and I listened to the house. The radiator tick, the pipe adjustment, the insulation settling, all the ordinary vocabulary of a structure I knew by heart. And above it all, or underneath it, in the place where the frightening thing had been for so many months, nothing. Just the house. Just my house with its sealed panel and its repainted ceiling and its kitchen table that I ate at now and its attic that I'd sat in on a May morning and let be what it was. I went to my office and I opened the log. I'd been adding to it less frequently since spring, the daily entries having reduced to weekly and then occasional, the documentation of a person working something out narrowing as the working out progressed. I added an entry for Ryan's visit. I wrote about the kitchen table and the attic and what Ryan had said about spaces being smaller than you expect. Then I wrote something at the end of the entry that I hadn't planned to write and that I read back afterward and recognized as true. I wrote, "The house is mine again, not the way it was mine before, which was a simpler ownership that didn't know its own assumptions. A different kind. The kind that has been tested and found to have limits and has been given those limits back as information instead of failure. I know this house now the way I know houses I've inspected after something went wrong in them and been repaired. Not just the bones, but the history of the bones. What they held and what they went through and what they're holding now. That's not a worse kind of knowing. It's more expensive and I'd have preferred the cheaper version if I'd had a choice, but it's more complete." I've thought about that entry a lot in the months since I wrote it. Whether I believed it when I wrote it or whether I was writing towards something I wanted to be true. I think both, honestly. I think I was partially there and partially writing myself the rest of the way, which is what the log had become, the instrument of a particular kind of working through that I hadn't known I needed and had found by accident. I did sell the house eventually, not because of what happened or not only because of what happened. I sold it 14 months after everything came out in the following December because I found a place I wanted more. A smaller house, newer, a 1970s split level with a clean structural history and no concealed spaces that I hadn't accounted for. I did the inspection myself. I spent 6 hours in it. I measured everything. I found one issue, a minor ductwork problem that I disclosed to the sellers and negotiated into the price. Everything else was what it should be. I stood in the new house on the first day I had the keys and I walked through every room. I stood in the bedroom and I looked at the ceiling. Lower this house 8 feet flat throughout the upper level, no attic above the bedroom. Just the structural members and above them directly the roof deck. No room for a channel, no concealed space between me and the outside. I thought about that for a while, the direct relationship between my bedroom ceiling and the sky. No intermediate space, nothing between me and the roof but the structure itself. I don't check the ceiling here in the mornings. That habit took about 3 weeks to stop being automatic. 3 weeks in the new house and the morning glance had gone because the body figures these things out when you give it the right conditions. The body is good at recalibrating when you let it. I still do property inspections. I'm better at them than I was in the specific way that you get better at something when you've been taught its limits by experience rather than by theory. I measure the spaces I can't see into on every inspection now. I pull out the tape and I do the arithmetic. I look for the panel that fits its frame too cleanly. I look for the worn edge, the settled dust disturbed by regular handling, the gap in the soffit that has been worked at over time. I've found 2 things in the 2 years since. 2 spaces in other people's houses that didn't add up, that had the arithmetic wrong, that had the concealed access quality when I knew to look for it. One of them was empty, had been empty for a long time, built as a service access in the 1950s and forgotten about in the same way mine had been. The other one I'm not going to describe in detail, except to say that I called the clients outside after I found it, and I told them calmly that we needed to contact the authorities before they moved in. And I stayed with them until the police arrived. And the look on their faces when they understood what I was telling them was a look I recognized from the inside. I told them what the officer had told me, that they were not crazy for feeling like something was wrong, that their instinct to call someone had been right, that the most important thing now was to get the space documented and secured. I told them that a house can hide something from the person who knows it best, and that finding it was not a failure. That not all gaps are discoverable until you know they exist. I told them that the house would be theirs again, that it would take time and it would not feel like it in the beginning, but it would be theirs again in a way that was more complete for having held this. They looked at me like they weren't sure they believed me yet. That's okay, you don't have to believe it immediately. You can believe it later, after the work, after the log entries and the May mornings in the attic and the first lunches back at the kitchen table, and the small incremental rehabilitation of a space that belonged to you even when it felt like it didn't. You can believe it when you get there. It'll still be true. I drive past my old house sometimes. The Craftsman with the dark painted siding that I put on in my 3rd year, The front garden that I never quite got right but kept trying with anyway. The windows I'd replaced on the north side where the old ones had fogged. Someone else lives there now. They've painted the trim a different color, a warm yellow that I think works better than what I had, which was a dark gray that I'd liked at the time and come to think was too somber. There are kids' bikes in the front yard sometimes. The garden bed in the back, the one with the perennials that I'd never planted but had kept alive for years, is probably still going, coming back every spring the way perennials do, stubborn and seasonal and not especially concerned with who's doing the tending. The roof looks good from the street. The shingles I'd had replaced 6 years ago were still holding when I sold. The chimney flashing was tight. The soffit on the north side was solid, permanently solid, sealed and fastened in a way that would outlast the current owners and probably the ones after them. The channel is still there above the back section of the second floor, empty, sealed, dark. The plywood panel in the front attic wall, the fasteners I put in on that night still holding. Whoever lives there now doesn't know about the panel. They didn't ask, and I disclosed what I was legally required to disclose and no more, which is a line I've thought about and which I've made a degree of peace with. What they don't know is that their house has a hidden space in it that was once used by a person who understood structures well enough to find what most people would miss. What they don't know is that the ordinary ceiling of their back bedroom was once penetrated by small holes through which another person looked down at the person sleeping below. What they don't know is that the ventilation movement of a body in a confined space once transmitted through the joists of their house as footsteps in the night, felt as weight, felt as the specific uneven gait of a specific person, heard eventually by a light sleeper who moved his bed to the wrong wall. What they don't know is that their house held all of that and held it quietly and is now holding something else, the ordinary daily life of whoever they are. The bikes in the yard and the yellow trim and whatever conversations happen in those rooms. Houses hold everything that happens in them. I believe that now in a way I didn't before. Not metaphysically, not mystically, just structurally. In the materials, in the worn edge of a panel handled many times, in the impression in old insulation that records the path of repeated transit. In the holes that were filled and painted over and are gone now but were there, and the ceiling remembers them in the way that plaster remembers what was done to it even after the repair. The faint ghost of different material in the surface that you'd only see if you knew to look. Houses hold everything, the loud, obvious things and the things that fit their frames too cleanly to notice. The history that the current owners know and the history that the structure keeps for itself. I know that now. I know it in the 11 years and then the rest of it way that you know things when they've been taught to you by the most expensive possible instructor. I check my ceilings now, not with fear, with attention. The specific, professional, permanently recalibrated attention of a man who learned the difference between knowing a house and knowing everything about a house, and who carries that lesson forward into every structure he enters, every space he measures, every concealed panel he now knows to look for. There's always something you haven't looked for yet. That's not a reason to be afraid of the spaces you live in. It's a reason to keep looking. It's a reason to measure everything. It's a reason when you hear a sound in the bones of your house to take it seriously, to document it, to follow it to wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere you didn't expect and would not have chosen. Because the sounds your house makes are real. All of them, even the ones you haven't explained yet. I bought a sound recorder in August. Not the handheld digital meter I'd used during the events, the one that measured airborne sound in the hallway and failed to register anything. A different kind. A contact microphone, the type that attaches directly to a surface and picks up vibration traveling through solid material rather than through air. The kind used in seismic monitoring and structural assessment, and I'd learned after some research in the documentation of exactly the kind of transmission through material sound events I'd experienced. I bought it because I was writing something. Not a report, not a log, something longer. I'd been asked by a colleague who ran a small professional newsletter for property inspectors to write about what had happened, specifically about the technical aspects, the sound transmission through structural members, the concealed space identification methodology, the camera placement gaps. A professional account for a professional audience. Practical takeaways. The kind of thing that might prevent another inspector from missing what I'd missed in my own house. I said yes because it seemed useful. I sat down to write it, and what came out was not the professional account I'd planned. What came out was the log, essentially the full version, with all the parts I'd been careful to leave out of the clinical language. The kitchen table, the morning ceiling glance, the smell in the channel, the detective's visit and what she'd told me about the person and the circumstances that had put them there. I wrote 30 pages before I realized I wasn't writing a newsletter piece. I was writing the whole thing down because writing it down was the last step of something that the log had started and the May morning in the attic had continued and the kitchen table lunches had built on. The working through that I'd been doing in pieces for over a year needed to be done in full, in one complete account, beginning to end, with all the parts included. The contact microphone was for the new house. I'd mounted it to a ceiling joist in the utility space above the garage, the one place in the new house where there was a small accessible void, 6 inches, nothing you could move through but enough to create a resonant cavity. I wanted to know what that space sounded like. I wanted to have a baseline recording of the normal vibration signature of my new house, so that if anything ever changed, I would have a reference point. That's the kind of person I am now. The kind who baselines things, who documents the normal so he can recognize the abnormal, who does not assume that the absence of obvious evidence means the absence of something worth knowing. The recordings were boring. Beautifully, completely, wonderfully boring. HVAC cycling, thermal expansion in the roof deck on warm afternoons, wind loading on the north wall in the evening, the water heater in the utility room sending a low hum through the framing when it fired up. All of it sourceable, all of it ordinary, all of it exactly what it should be in a house built in 1974 with clean structural bones and no hidden spaces. I listened to those recordings and I felt something that took me a while to name. Safe? I felt safe in the specific active way, not the passive taken for granted safety of before, but the earned kind. The kind you have when you've done the work to verify that the space you're in is what it presents itself as being. The kind that has a foundation under it. The newsletter piece ran in September, 2 years after the October that started everything. I'd trimmed it back to the professional content eventually, the practical methodology, the lessons about concealed space identification and camera placement, and the arithmetic of void spaces. But I kept one paragraph that the editor, a practical woman who usually cut sentiment without ceremony, left in without comment. The paragraph said, "The most important tool in a structural assessment is not any instrument you carry. It is the willingness to take seriously the thing you cannot yet explain, to sit with the unexplained rather than reaching immediately for the nearest available explanation. The nearest available explanation is often right, but when it isn't, the cost of having applied it anyway is paid by the person living in the house." I meant every word of that. I mean it more now than I did when I wrote it. The contact microphone is still mounted in the utility space, still recording. The files stack up on the hard drive, nights and days of the ordinary sound of a house being a house, and I check them weekly, and they are always what they should be, and every time they are what they should be I note it, and I feel the earned kind of safety, and I move on with my day. Some mornings I still catch myself starting the ceiling glance. The old reflex, the one that took 3 weeks to stop being automatic in the new house. It comes back occasionally, the way old reflexes do, and when it does I let it happen. I look at the ceiling of my bedroom in the new house, the flat 8-foot plaster ceiling with nothing above it but structural members and roof, deck, and sky, and I look at it the way I look at everything now. With attention. With the specific, professional, permanently recalibrated attention of someone who learned the hard way that looking and seeing are not always the same thing, and who has decided that the difference between them is worth whatever it costs to close. Walter sold his house in March. I didn't find out until after it happened, which was strange given that we'd been neighbors for 11 years and had the kind of relationship where significant things got mentioned over the fence. But the winter had been hard on him, his back getting worse and the house getting harder to manage alone, and his daughter in Portland had apparently been making the case for months that he should come out there. He'd resisted for a long time, and then one day he'd stopped resisting, the way people do when the argument they've been winning against themselves finally runs out of energy. I found out from a mutual acquaintance on the street, a woman named Patricia who walked her dog past both our houses every morning and who functioned as the informal information network for the block. She told me on a Wednesday that Walter had signed with a realtor and was moving in 6 weeks. I went over that evening. He answered the door in his usual way, unhurried, the specific steadiness of a man who had decided long ago that most things didn't require rushing toward. He looked the same. A little thinner maybe, the winter thinness that older people get when the cold takes more from them than it used to. He stepped back and let me in without ceremony, and we went to his kitchen, and he put the kettle on the same way he always had. The automatic hospitality of someone for whom making tea for a visitor was simply what you did. His house was already starting to look like a house in the process of being left. Not dramatically, just the small signs. A stack of flattened boxes in the hallway, a section of the bookshelf in the living room that had been cleared, the books presumably already packed, leaving a gap that the remaining books leaned into slightly. The particular quality of a space that knows it's being vacated, though I'm aware that's the kind of thing I notice and other people might not. We sat at his kitchen table and drank our tea, and he told me about the decision. Portland, his daughter's house, a granny flat in the back of her property that she had built 2 years ago for exactly this eventual purpose. He talked about it practically, the logistics of it, the things he was keeping and the things he was giving away and the things he hadn't decided about yet. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, without dramatizing just the thing as it was. I said, I'm going to miss you. He said, you moved. I said, I know, but knowing you were there mattered. He looked at me over his tea. He said, how are you doing, really? I said, better, genuinely better. He said, the new house. I said, the new house is good, clean, no surprises. He said, you checked. I said, thoroughly. He nodded. He said, I think about it sometimes, what I heard all those nights. I said, I know, me too. He said, I feel like I should have said something sooner, more than I did. I said, you told me when I asked directly. That's what I needed. He said, I heard it longer than I told you, even that day at the fence. I looked at him. He said, I'd been hearing it since the previous spring, a year before you started noticing it. I thought it was raccoons. I thought it was your problem to deal with if it was anything. I didn't want to be the neighbor who rang the doorbell to say, I think you have raccoons. I said a year. He said, roughly, maybe 14 months by the time everything came out. I sat with that. 14 months corroborated from Walter's side, not the 8 I'd originally understood. 14. I thought about what that meant for the arithmetic I'd been doing in my head for 2 years. The timeline I'd constructed. The adjusted version was longer by half a year than I'd been carrying. I said, it doesn't change anything practically. He said, no, but I wanted you to know before I left. It felt like something I owed you. I said, you don't owe me anything. He said, I know, I wanted to anyway. We sat there for a while longer. He talked about his daughter and the flat in Portland and the garden she'd planted that he was looking forward to. He talked about his back and the stairs in his current house and the relief of the idea of a single-floor space. He talked about the street and the neighbors and the 23 years he'd lived in the house, and what that accumulation of time in a place felt like when you were about to leave it. He said, do you think the new people will hear anything? I said, no, the space is sealed. Whatever was there is gone. He said, you're sure? I said, as sure as I can be about anything. He said, that's an honest answer. I said, it's the only kind I have left. He walked me to the door when I left. We shook hands on his front porch the way we'd been shaking hands for 11 years, the specific handshake of 2 private men who had been good neighbors to each other and knew it. He said, take care of yourself. I said, you too. Safe trip to Portland. He said, come visit sometime. She's got a guest room. I said I might. I walked home in the March evening, the specific quality of March dark that is winter loosening its grip without fully letting go, the air cold but not biting, the smell of something almost like spring underneath the cold. I walked the 4 blocks to my new house and let myself in and stood in the entryway for a moment. The house was quiet. The ordinary quiet of a well-built space at the end of an evening, the HVAC ticking down from the day's cycle, the refrigerator's low hum from the kitchen. The specific settled silence of a house that was doing exactly what a house was supposed to do. 14 months. I went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at my own table and thought about 14 months. About Walter lying awake with his bad back in the small hours and hearing something from my roof and deciding it was raccoons and deciding it was my problem to handle and going back to trying to sleep. About all the nights in that 14 months that I had slept without knowing. The full span of it. You can drive yourself into a bad place thinking about the full span of it. I knew that from experience. I'd done it plenty in the first year, the spiraling arithmetic of not knowing, the calculation of all the nights and all the things done privately in the belief of solitude. I'd learned, slowly and with effort, to put a boundary on that calculation, to acknowledge the span and then to not stand in it too long. 14 months was the span. I acknowledged it. I held it for a moment, the full weight of it, and then I set it down in the way I'd learned to set things down, not by forgetting them, but by placing them in the part of your understanding where things are kept rather than the part where they're carried. I drank my tea. The kitchen was warm and quiet and ordinary. I thought about Walter in Portland, the granny flat his daughter had built for this eventual day, the garden he was looking forward to. I thought about how a person decides when to stop resisting and what they feel when they finally do. I thought about the contact microphone in the utility space and the recordings stacking up on the hard drive, night after night of ordinary structural sound. I thought about the baseline I'd established in the new house, the reference point I'd built for myself so that difference would be recognizable. I thought about how long it had taken me to build a baseline in the old house. 11 years. 11 years of accumulated knowledge, every tick and groan and pressure adjustment, until I knew the building the way a person knows music they've heard 10,000 times. And how all of that accumulated knowing had still contained a gap large enough to hold 14 months of something I hadn't recognized. The gap wasn't ignorance. That was the thing I'd finally gotten clear on, the thing that had taken 2 years to settle into its right shape. The gap wasn't a failure of attention or expertise or care. The gap was the specific structural gap that exists in any framework of understanding. The place where the framework ends and the unknown begins, and the unknown doesn't announce itself. It just sits in the gap and waits for the conditions that make it recognizable. You close gaps by knowing they exist, by measuring the spaces you can't see into, by doing the arithmetic, by not assuming that the absence of obvious evidence means the absence of anything worth knowing. You don't close them completely. That's the thing I'd had to accept. You do the work and you close the ones you can find and you build the best baseline you know how to build and you stay attentive and you document and you follow the sounds to wherever they lead. And you hold the possibility always that there are gaps you haven't found yet, not with fear, with the honest professional acknowledgement that a framework has edges and the world doesn't. I rinsed my cup and turned off the kitchen light and walked through the quiet house to my bedroom. I lay down and looked at the ceiling. 8 feet of flat plaster, the ordinary ceiling of an ordinary room, nothing above it but joists and deck and the March night sky. I didn't do the morning glance anymore, but the last look before sleep, the brief upward check before I closed my eyes, that one I'd kept, not from fear, not from the old reflex, from the new habit, the recalibrated one. Just looking, just making sure the sailing was the sailing and the room was the room and the house was doing what the house was supposed to do. It always was now. I closed my eyes and the house settled around me into its nighttime vocabulary, and I listened to it the way I'd always listened to houses, the professional attention that had become something more than professional, something that had been taught its own limits and had come back from that teaching more careful and more complete. The sounds were all right, every one of them sourced and familiar and ordinary. I slept,